Round 2 of Contractors, Foxes, Ceska or Grupo. Yay! So, around a year ago, I did this lovely video, Contractors, Foxes, Ceska or Grupo, with Ouroboros specifically for getting through things like the incursion. I had a little bit of open world stuff in there, just to like try and make it a little bit more balanced and even for what people would actively be doing. However, since now that Ceska has gone from 10% crit chance down to 8 and Grupo's gone from 15% crit damage down to 13, along with the fact that things like Elmo's, Oreo, a few other things are no longer up there, we now need to do this all over again and have a look at the stats. And because Oreo is no longer the answer to everything, well, Oreo or Regulus is no longer the answer to everything, we actually need to go a little bit more in depth. So in this one, we're just going to be covering ARs as like a broad spectrum. There are going to be tiny little caveats here and there, depending on if you're weird and use Eagle Bearer or crazy and use Bighorn, or if you're an absolute Giga Chad and use Chameleon. So there are going to be slight nuances here and there. I don't really plan on covering Eagle Bearer or Bighorn, simply just because why? However, I will be doing a separate video for this just covering Chameleon, and then I'll be doing another one for SMGs. Like I said, this one is just for those sexy assault rifles. So just as a recap, all builds are going to be 4-piece strikers, Coyote's Mask, and then we're going to play around with either a Ceska piece, or potentially, if you fancy it, maybe a Grupo piece. Grupo's not your thing. How about Contractor's Gloves? Ooh, damage to armor. Or, as most people would assume, Fox's Prayer. And we're just going to be looking at, essentially, out of these 4 builds, what one, technically, is the best. Now, all of these builds have been squeezed down to be around 50% crit chance, just to make it even, as well as allow for the Coyote's buff to actually do what Coyote buff do. This does mean that all of the builds are at 50% crit chance, minus the one with Ceska, which ends up being at 52. This is the best we can do, but hey, this is what Ceska does. And now we're just going to look at the numbers. So these are the builds in numerical form. All the rolls are there. Hopefully you can see that like there's variations between crit chance, crit damage, blah blah blah, and the actual DPS comes out as. Now, if you watched the previous video that I did on this, there has been one changed where Foxes were the weakest. They're no longer the actual weakest. Grupo is now technically the weakest. Then Foxes, then Contractors, then Ceska. Contractors still do win if you are doing something like the incursion on the Lovebirds and you're specifically just going for the head. Contractors will still win in that one very specific scenario, but the rest of the time Ceska is basically dominating in overall performance, because whatever you would gain on headshot you lose on body, or whatever you gain on body you lose on head. Ceska is just very much middle ground. Ceska is still basically owning that entire area. I then did the same thing again, but this time I removed Coyote's Mask and went for a Fenris piece. So again, Fenris Ceska and then Fenris Grupo. Remember, Fenris gives us 10% AR. And then obviously Fenris Contractors. And of course, finally, Fenris Fox's Prayer. And I did the whole entire math equation again. This is what the builds look like. Essentially, we've just lost a fair chunk of crit damage, but we have gained another 10% in our all-weapon damage. We're not going to be looking or going into expertise because that just diminishes the overall result. Now, I find these results interesting because the gap between Contractors and Ceskas has remained the same, but Grupo and Foxes have dropped dramatically. So, Grupo is still technically the worst without something like Coyotes. However, Foxes are barely hanging on at all. Now, obviously, those that are a bit more astute among you might notice that the percentages we're talking about are tiny. And you are correct. I mentioned this in my first one. The overall difference between all of these builds with Coyotes is like 0.65%. Like, it's barely 0.5%. It barely is worth mentioning. But this is something that I've seen a lot of people argue about, and I like a good argument, what can I say? But yeah, like, How you actually want to go about building your 4-piece strikers with coyotes, whether you want to use Ceska, Grupo, Contractors or Foxes, it mostly doesn't matter unless you're going for like an absolute mid-max build, which is Ceska's the only answer, to be perfectly honest. Again though, unless you are going for something like incursion speedruns, in which case Contractors, specifically with ARs, is still winning. Because, you know, multipliers. But yeah. And then without coyotes, the difference we're talking about is 0.28%. So it's even smaller. So yeah, take what you will from this information. It barely is worth mentioning, like I said. And unless you're mid-maxing your speedrunning, you're not going to even notice at all the difference. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Have fun, good luck, don't die. It's bad for the health.